Okay, hello everybody. Today we're here in Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020 in Just Flight's Piper Warrior 2. We have a 181 nautical mile flight from Sierra Yankee Romeo, Syracuse Hancock to Tango Echo Bravo, Teterboro. We'll be flying IFR, and we'll have the Warrior configured just to have 2 nav radios and a DME. So, hope you're up for a challenge. We're going to go old school and use nothing but radio navigation and Victor Airways to get ourselves from point A to point B. Let's hop into the pilot seat and get started. Syracuse is a pay-aware airport by Sierra Sim, available on the Aerosoft website. Alright, as we run through the checklist, I'll take you through the pilot's brief. So we are flying IFR, departing from Syracuse. We'll be flying at a cruise altitude of 7,000, which means we'll be using the low altitude en route IFR charts and the Victor Airways. For our departure, Syracuse does have a single SID, which is Syracuse 2. It is comically simple. It just says radar vectors to your initial fix and climb and maintain 4,000 along with the heading, depending on which runway you're taking off of. We will not be flying a star, but our approach to Teterboro will be the runway 19er ILS. That's it. We've got a couple Victor Airways to manage, some VORs, and an ILS to fly at the end. Okay, to walk you through how I picked my routes, my altitudes, and my nav aids, it's easiest just to bring up SkyVector and move around the map and point with the mouse cursor. So we are taking off from Syracuse, which is up here in the upper left, and we are going down to Teterboro, which is down in the lower right. I've got the en route low altitude airways up. So these are Victor and T routes. If I zoom in near Syracuse, you can see the Victor routes are in black, so those use VORs to navigate, and the T routes are in blue, and those use RNAV navigation to navigate. So for us, that's easy. We don't have RNAV navigation on the Piper Warrior, so we can't use any of these blue routes. So we're limited to the black Victor routes. So which one to choose? Now that one's pretty easy too. If I zoom back out, the only Victor route heading east is the one I chose, Victor 433. The other one is Victor 429, but that kind of jogs down south and west. So done. We're going to start out by intercepting Victor 433. And the next question is, how do we get on it? So you're going to need vectors to an initial fix. And there's 2 choices. We can go to, from Syracuse, we can go to Stoda, or we can go to Tibor. Now, you can probably get a hint looking at Stoda why that's a bad choice. See the ILS here? So if I bring up Syracuse's runway 28 ILS and zoom in, there is Stoda. So Stoda is one of the initial waypoints for the ILS. So if we go there, we're going to vector ourselves out to incoming traffic, which seems like a bad place to go. So we're going to skip Stoda, and we're going to go right to Tibor. So if we were running with live ATC, we would get radar vectors from departure to Tibor, and that would probably be somewhere around the 126 heading that you see here. We're actually going to self-vector for this flight because we're not using live ATC, and Microsoft's in-game ATC is not very good for radar vectors. So after we get on to Tibor, then we start flying along Victor 433 south to Rockdale, RKA VOR, and that's right down here. Now if you haven't looked at IFR plates before, they're a little confusing, but you'll get them pretty quickly. So here's a short tutorial. On the Victor 433 block, the number above it is the minimum en route altitude, so we need to fly above 4,000 if we want to be able to pick up the VOR the entire way. And sometimes there's a second number with an asterisk, which would be the minimum obstacle clearance altitude, so that's what you have to fly above not to crash into things. If that's not listed there, it's the same as the MEA, so that's 4,000 also. So when we pick our altitude, it has to be above 4,000 for this leg. The number underneath it is the distance of the leg. It's 23 nautical miles. I'm sorry, the distance of the segment. So that's 23 nautical miles, and the segment, this particular segment, is from Sherb to Rockdale VOR. The next little segment from Sherb to Eaton has a 6, so that's 6. From Eaton to Dino has a 5, so that's 5. You'll also see numbers in rounded boxes, and those are the cumulative distances. So if I were to add 23 for Rockdale to Sherb, plus 6 from Sherb to Eaton, I would get 29. All right, so the cumulative distance to Eaton is 29. Add another 5, and I get 34. Add another 4, and I get 38. So that's how you read them. And that's going to be really important for our flight because we're going to be using the VOR to know what radial we're flying, to make sure that we're actually on the airway. And then we're going to use those distances along with our DME to know where we are on the airway. So constantly through this flight, we're going to need to know those distances that we are from the VOR to use as indicators of where we are along our journey. Continuing on south, we head past Rockdale and on to Delancey VOR. This is all still the Victor 483/Victor 433 airway. At Delancey, we're going to change direction. We'll still be on the Victor 483 airway because airways don't need to be straight, right? They can change directions at nav aids and VORs. And that direction change is 130. So you could see the 130 here. This is the 130 radial from Delancey. So we're going to follow that. And I'm going to switch to the low area map so we can see this better. There we go. We're going to follow that until we get to Phillips waypoint. Now this might be your first, wait a minute, if you're familiar with navigation, because Phillips waypoint is an intersection, right? Normally I'd put that into my GPS as an RNAV location and I would go to it. But because it's an intersection, it's also defined as the intersection of two radials from VORs. So we're coming from Delancey on the left here. And if I zoom out, this radial is all the way up here at Albany. So this is the intersection of the Albany and Delancey radials. And we talked about the distances before, so if I look at the distances of the different segments, I can add up or get the cumulative distance. In this case, it's 55 for Phillips from my VOR and 29 from my Delancey VOR. So now I've got two distances, two VORs, and I can precisely pinpoint when I arrive at Phillips. So when I'm flying, I'm going to look for my CDI to center up for the radial that I'm intercepting, the Albany radial, and I'm going to look for my DME to read the correct distance. And that is how I will know that I'm at Phillips, and I can turn on to the Victor 489 radial from Albany. That radial is the 222. That's what the number is up here. So I'll be flying the 222 heading for the 222 radial from Albany. There's another direction change, which is weird. Literally, W-E-A-R-D, weird, I'm not sure how you say that. And that is the intersection of the Albany radial and the Huguenot radial. Now I'll give you a spoiler. In the simulator, this is where I ran into problems because I lost the Albany VOR someplace between Phillips and Weird. I lost the signal. So Microsoft Flight Simulator is actually pretty good about managing VORs. It'll make sure you're up to a certain altitude before you can pick up the signal. And as you fly away from the VOR, depending on your altitude, at some point you're going to lose it. In real life, somebody's figured all that out. That's the whole point of the Victor Airways. So they've figured out that if you fly at 7,000, which is the MEA, on the Victor 489 airway, you will still be able to pick up the Albany VOR even along this segment. This line does not extend to another VOR beyond here, so it's only the Albany one. So flying IFR, I should have been able to pick it up, but Microsoft Flight Simulator didn't know that. It just has some math, and it conked out somewhere around here. So I had to think on my feet pretty quickly. I think I was in a cloud at the time, of course, and come up with another way to get to Weird. Fortunately, Weird is set distance and radial from Huguenot. So you can just put in the DME. So Weird is 21 from Huguenot, and it's along the 019 radial from Huguenot. So a little bit of fiddling with your nav radios, and you can locate Weird pretty quickly. So from Weird, then we head on down to Huguenot. And Huguenot is where we get off. So we've been flying airways up to this point. Once we reach Huguenot, you'll see the flight plan no longer follows the Victor 273 airway, but goes rogue. And the reason it goes rogue is because we're going to do our approach at that point. So as you see it on the screen here, this would be direct from Huguenot right to the airport, but we are going to fly the ILS runway 19er approach, which looks like this. So at this point, this is where ATC would give us vectors, because we don't have a way to get from Huguenot to the initial approach fix on our own, so ATC would have to steer us. We don't have RNAV, so we can't just plug in the initial approach fix of Strad and go direct to it. And Strad, as listed on the plate, doesn't have any references to VORs or distances, so you have no idea where Strad is, right? That's why the plate up at the top here says RNAV, GPS, or radar required for procedure entry. There's no way to get there just using VORs. We're not using live ATC for this, so we're going to fudge it a little. And I mean, I said there's no way to get there using VORs, but really it's a radial from the Huguenot VOR at a set distance. So if you put in Strad, you can see it's the 149 radial from a distance of 18 miles. So we've got DME and we've got that. So that's how we're going to fudge it. But in real life, of course, you can't fudge it. You would be talking to ATC and they'd be vectoring you there. In Microsoft Flight Simulator's ATC stinks for vectors. It'll just say proceed to next waypoint, which is about as helpful as your car GPS saying drive to destination. It's like, what? Why do I have a GPS? Tell me what the next step is. So that's why we're going to do it the way we're doing it. So from Strad to Scooby is along the 131 heading. Scooby to Naipe is along the 131 heading again, and each of those is 4.9 nautical miles. We can still get an estimate of that with our DME. Now again, we wouldn't do that in real life, right? Because we can't VOR self-navigate. But that's how we're getting around not using ATC for this. Then from Nippy, we're going to fly the 150 heading, a distance of 5.8, to Unville, which is where we'll intercept the ILS. And then from there, we're still using DME. So Unville's at 11.5 from the localizer. So we'll be able to tick down the DME settings along this 195 heading to identify Unville and tugs. The last thing to talk is the altitude. We're going to fly at 7,000 for our cruise altitude. The way I came up with that number was to look at each of my segments and locate the minimum en route altitude, and then pick a cruise altitude that was at or above that. The highest minimum en route altitude is this segment here, which is 7,000. So there you have it. We're flying at 7,000. Everything else is 4,000 to 5,000 for the segments. Our descent point will have to start after Weird, because this segment's 7,000, the next segment's 4,000. The other altitude restriction we have is on the departure. The Syracuse 2 departure had climb and maintain 4,000, expect filed 10 minutes after departure. So we would be restricted to 4,000 as we flew our initial segment to Teterboro. And then at some point, ATC would contact us and tell us to climb up to our cruise altitude. For this flight, I'm just going to use Teterboro. And once I reach Teterboro, then I'll self-clear myself to climb up to 7,000 because we're not talking to live ATC. Now that's a lot to process, and it's going to be a little hard to follow what I'm doing in the flights video as you go along. However, I've written all of this up in detail on my blog. So if you follow the channel, you know I'm a sci-fi author, and I have a blog for both my books, but also just random things that I find interesting, one of which is flight simulation. So you'll find posts about flight simulation and aviation there. So if you go there, I'll put the link in the details. You can find a step-by-step with all the frequencies, all the nav aids I'm using, the headings, when to turn radios to new navigation, when to flip things on the autopilot. So it's a recipe for this flight. So if you want to do this yourself, in particular if you're just trying to learn about IFR flying in flight simulation, and you want to have a start to end walkthrough on how to do an IFR flight. I think it's a good exercise. I learned a lot doing it, and if you follow along, you'll probably really understand IFR plates, IFR low altitude plates a lot better, and how to construct an IFR flight plan. All right, let's hop back into the cockpit and continue with our prep. What's really going to be complicated about this flight is that the Piper Warrior has a NAV1 and NAV2 radio, a CDI1, CDI2, and a DME. So there's no standby frequencies for either of those. That means we're going to need to juggle radio frequencies throughout the flight and try to stay 1 or 2 steps ahead of our aircraft. Otherwise, things are going to get out of hand quickly and we're going to get ourselves lost. There's no GPS for this. There is a Garmin 100, I think, is the model for the Warrior here too, but I'm going to leave it off, and we're just going to use VOR navigation. Syracuse clearance, November 359 Golf Charlie, IFR to Teterboro, ready to copy. Cleared to Teterboro via the Syracuse 2 departure, climb via the SID, radar vectors T-bore, then as filed, climb and maintain 4,000, expect 7,000, 10 minutes after departure. Departure 126.125, squawk 3414, November 359 Golf Charlie. Okay, while we're on the ground, we're going to get NAV1, NAV2, or DME and heading bug set up. So NAV1, we're going to tune to 112.6, which is the Rockdale VOR. That'll be our first VOR. NAV2 we'll set up to Delancey, which is 112.1. For CDI1, which is Rockdale, we're going to dial in a heading of 156. For CDI2, which is Delancey, we'll dial in a heading of 130. We'll turn on our DME and make sure that it's coupled to NAV1, which is Rockdale, so that'll give us our distance from Rockdale VOR. And we'll go to our heading bug and set it up for 126, which is our initial vector to T-bore waypoint. Syracuse ground, Piper 359 Golf Charlie with information India. South ramp near November, request taxi. Taxi and hold short, runway 28, cross runway 33 via November, Yankee, Mike Lima, Piper 359 Golf Charlie.
Syracuse clearance, QNAT 627. United 627, Syracuse clearance, cleared to Newark via 9 Hancock, as filed, 126, 112, and squawk is 3556, QNAT 627, 1 Hancock, Flossy 40, 967.
Your DME source selector switch is the right switch above the GPS. Make sure that's set to NAV1. Similarly, the autopilot has a source switch to the right of the autopilot below the yoke. Syracuse Tower, Piper 359 Golf Charlie, holding short, runway 28. Cleared for departure, runway 28, Piper 359 Golf Charlie. Clear left. Clear right. Clear straight ahead. And we are good. I'll say while we're getting set up here that I've been flying the Aerosoft CRJ 700 a lot lately. I think I've done probably a dozen flights, and it's a very automated aircraft. So you are, programming a CDU and putting in all of your waypoints and managing your speed and altitude. You've got a lot of settings for things, and it left me wanting to do a flight like this. I really wanted to hop back into the Warrior, turn off the GPS, and just navigate with radios. So kind of go old school with very little technology, and I wanted to do a longer flight like this. Right? It's not trivial. There's a lot of ways that you can get lost during this flight, and the real challenge is going to be managing the radios. There's no standby, so do things in the wrong order or don't have something set up, and you'll blaze right past the waypoint, and then you're going to have a bear of a time playing catch up to try to get yourself back on course. So it should be fun. I hope you try it. It's a cool challenge. We are taking off from runway 28. I'm using the scattered clouds preset here. That's intentional to give us a good mix of clouds and sun so that we'd be going in and out of clouds throughout the flight, because I really wanted to get some IMC but not be in the soup for the entire flight. With that, you usually get winds out of 270, which is why you'll probably end up taking off from runway 28 if you do this same flight. There's the outer marker indicator. And here is where I think ATC would start vectoring us, so they give us vectors to Teterboro. We are listening to liveatc.net in the background. It's actually my favorite way to fly in the simulator if I'm not talking to somebody, because it has the actual traffic for the airport. If you fly in VATSIM, for example, VATSIM's great, but for general aviation aircraft, the odds of there being anybody else near you or around you, or even taking off from your airport, is slim. So you're going to have silence around your airport. You may hear other traffic further out. But for immersion, this is the way I like to go. The downside is you'll hear me just talking to ATC, but I'm not actually talking to ATC. We're just practicing our radio calls. Now we'll hop down here and use some autopilot help. So there's a little switch to the right of the autopilot. Make sure that's in nav 1, and we'll click it on heading mode. Remember, we set up our heading bug when we were on the ground to our initial heading to Teterboro. Now, of course, just flying the heading will only get us close to Teterboro. We need to get exactly to Teterboro, and we can do that because we've got CDI-1 set up with the Rockdale VOR and the Victor airway we want to intercept. So we'll look for that to center up, and we know the DME of Teterboro along that Victor airway. So when the DME is correct and the CDI is centered, we are exactly at Teterboro, and that will be the time to turn onto the Victor airway. Okay, I think you've heard me talk enough for now, so we're going to cue the music for a musical montage. I'll overlay some text for different things that are happening during the flight. Remember, if you want the nitty-gritty details, you can just go to my website. I've written this up as a recipe for the flight, and you can follow it step by step to recreate it on your own. So let's sit back and enjoy that awesome flight simulator scenery. Alright, I love flying like that. I was busy the entire flight, juggling radios, adjusting CDIs, tracking DME. I even had the curveball there where I lost the VOR signal unexpectedly and had to think on my feet, pull up the map, figure out what to do, but it all worked out. The landing didn't go great. I was fine on the ILS, and then I had this huge stutter which froze everything up, and when it unfroze, my plane had jogged off like 30, 40 feet to the left. So I was on short final, and trying to recover that resulted in a not very nice landing. I know that's like blaming my baseball glove on me dropping the ball, but that's what happened. Should have done a go around, but I just decided to try to save it. So if you enjoy content like this, be sure to click that like button, leave me a comment, and don't forget to subscribe. Thanks as always for flying along with me, and stay tuned for further flight adventures.